The Sullivan house stood at the edge of the Virginia woods, like it had grown there rather than been built, its beams darkened by time and secrets soaked deep into the grain. In 1834, it was known as a quiet place, respectable, the sort of home people passed without looking twice. Smoke rose from its chimney on schedule. The garden was kept neat. The family attended church when it suited them. Nothing about the house suggested that it was listening. At dusk, the land around it changed. Crickets went silent near the foundation, and the air thickened as if the ground itself were holding its breath. Those who walked past swore the earth hummed faintly beneath their boots. A vibration felt more than heard. The Sullivans dismissed such talk with polite smiles, insisting the house settled strangely at night. Inside, the floors were scrubbed clean, yet a smell lingered: iron, damp stone, and something older. The basement door remained locked, its key never visible, its hinges recently oiled, despite no one ever seeing it opened. When questioned, the family spoke of storage, of cold preservation, of a space too dangerous for visitors. Their voices never wavered. Children were seen at the windows sometimes, more faces than names ever given. They watched silently, eyes following passers-by with an intensity that felt wrong for the young. If waved at, they did not wave back. They simply counted. On certain nights, when the moon hung low and red, the house seemed to sink inward. Light bent oddly around it, and from below, from somewhere under the floorboards and beyond the cellar walls, came the faint sound of chains shifting, followed by a hush so sudden it felt rehearsed. Like dozens of breaths stopping at once, waiting for permission to begin again, the census taker arrived at the Sullivan property on a gray morning in 1834, carrying a leather-bound ledger already heavy with names, births, and deaths that blurred together after miles of dirt roads. He was a meticulous man by reputation, known for correcting others' errors and recounting numbers from memory with unsettling precision. When he knocked on the Sullivan door, he expected nothing more than another routine tally, a brief exchange, a polite nod. Instead, he was invited inside and seated at a long table where the air felt thick, unmoving, as though the house itself resisted disturbance. "Mr. Sullivan answered the questions calmly, listing names with practiced ease, while his wife stood behind him, her eyes fixed on the floorboards rather than the visitor. As the names accumulated on the page, the census taker slowed his pen. Children's names filled the lines one after another, far more than the modest home could reasonably hold. He paused, counted again, and politely asked for clarification. Mr. Sullivan smiled and repeated the number without hesitation. 47. The word landed heavily in the room, absurd in its certainty. The census taker glanced toward the walls, the narrow staircase, the single hallway leading deeper into the house. He saw no signs of such a brood, no noise, no running feet, no laughter. Only silence. Assuming an error, he questioned ages next, expecting the list to correct itself through impossibility. But the ages formed a pattern, staggered carefully, as though arranged rather than born. Some children shared the same birthday. Others seemed not to age at all, their years recorded the same as the last census entry from a decade earlier, though no such previous record should have existed. When he pointed this out, Mrs. Sullivan finally looked up, her expression empty, and said the children were kept below during the day. A phrase offered without explanation or apology. The census taker's unease deepened when he asked to see the children, a request well within his authority. The room cooled noticeably. Mr. Sullivan declined, citing illness, then weather, then tradition, each excuse layered carefully atop the last. The visitor noted how neither adult contradicted the other, how their breathing seemed synchronized, how the house itself creaked softly beneath them, like a warning. Reluctantly, he continued writing, his ink pressing harder into the paper, as if to anchor the impossible truth he was recording. When he left the property, the ledger felt heavier than before. He reviewed the entry again beneath the open sky, convinced he must have miswritten, misunderstood something fundamental. Yet every number was clear, every name deliberate, and as he mounted his horse, he realized with growing dread that official records were not meant to question reality, only preserve it, and what he had just preserved was something that should never have existed, something buried beneath a house that did not want to be seen, something that had already learned how to hide the sounds, began quietly enough that no one could agree on when they truly started, only that once noticed they could not be unheard. In the months following the census taker's visit, neighbors living nearest the Sullivan property found their sleep interrupted by a steady, deliberate rhythm rising from the ground. After nightfall, it was not the chaotic clatter of animals or the shifting groan of old timber, but something measured, almost patient, like iron meeting stone at regular intervals. The noise carried best in still weather, drifting across the fields when the wind died, and the woods seemed to lean closer to listen. At first, people explained it away with comforting logic. Old houses settled, especially those built over damp earth. Cellars flooded and dried, beams expanded and contracted. Some suggested Mr. Sullivan had taken to working late below the house, repairing foundations or breaking rock for a new well. The idea fit neatly enough, even if no one ever saw tools carried in or debris hauled out. In a place where everyone depended on each other's goodwill, suspicion was an inconvenience best avoided. But the rhythm persisted, night after night, unchanged. Those who lay awake counting the beats noticed that it never sped up or slowed down. It did not respond to weather, to season, or to the passage of time. One farmer claimed it matched the pace of a human heartbeat, slowed almost to the point of stopping. Another swore it sounded like chains being drawn carefully across stone, then lifted, then set down again. When he said this aloud, his wife hushed him sharply, crossing herself as if the sound itself might hear its name spoken. Children were the first to show fear. They refused to play near the Sullivan fence after dark, complaining of vibrations in the ground that made their teeth buzz. One boy ran home screaming that the earth had knocked back when he stamped his foot, as though something beneath had answered him. His father scolded him for imagination, yet avoided the road near the house for weeks afterward. Even the dogs behaved strangely, whining and pacing when the sound began, tails tucked, ears flattened, as if confronted with something they could sense but not see. Occasionally, a neighbor would gather the courage to investigate, standing at the edge of the property with a lantern held high. From there, the noise seemed to soften, slipping away just beyond clear hearing, leaving only the unsettling impression that it was still happening, just out of reach. No light ever shone from the basement windows. No figures moved behind the curtains. The Sullivan house remained dark and still, its silence almost accusatory, as though offended by the attention. During the day, the rhythm was gone. The earth lay quiet, innocent, offering no evidence of the night's disturbance. Those who mentioned the sounds over morning chores felt foolish once the sun was high. Words like imagination and nerves were passed around generously. Life demanded practicality, and the idea of something unnatural occurring beneath a familiar neighbor's home was too heavy to carry alongside planting, harvesting, and survival. Yet doubt crept in through small details. Mrs. Harper, whose bedroom window faced the Sullivan property, noticed that the sound always began after the last candle in their house went out. Mr. Collins, returning late from town, realized it stopped the moment his horse neared the Sullivan gate, resuming only after he rode away. A midwife, walking home under a thin moon, felt the ground tremble beneath her feet and heard what she described as breathing woven between the metallic beats, a collective exhale that rose and fell as one. People began to sleep less. Conversations trailed off when night approached. Doors were bolted earlier. The rhythm did not threaten directly, yet its persistence felt intentional, like a signal meant for those willing to listen. It suggested effort, labor without rest, repetition without purpose, and the unsettling possibility that whatever caused it did not grow tired, because it did not need to. When questioned casually at church, the Sullivans smiled and blamed rodents, water flow, or shifting stone. Explanations delivered so smoothly they felt rehearsed. They never expressed irritation at the rumors, only mild amusement, which somehow made the neighbors more uneasy. A man who grows angry can be confronted. A man who finds fear amusing cannot. As weeks turned into months, the sound became part of the night itself, woven into the fabric of darkness alongside owls and wind through trees. Yet unlike those natural companions, it carried intention. Each beat felt placed, deliberate, as though counted. Those lying awake began to sense patterns within it. Pauses that felt like listening, resumptions that felt like acknowledgement. Some claimed the rhythm aligned with the household above, echoing footsteps, responding to movement, aware of who was awake and who had surrendered to sleep. By the time the idea of something being wrong fully took root, it had already been normalized, filed away under inconvenience and unease. The neighbors had learned to live with the sound by refusing to name it, by pretending it belonged to the earth, rather than to whatever the earth concealed. And so each night, as darkness settled over the Sullivan house and the fields beyond, the rhythm began again beneath the soil, patient, measured, and unchallenged, continuing its work unseen and uninterrupted, waiting for the moment when listening would no longer be optional. The disappearance of the Sullivan child unfolded so quietly that, for weeks, no one could say exactly when the absence began. It was a girl, though even her age became uncertain once people started trying to remember her clearly. Some recalled her as 8, others as nearly grown, which troubled them later, because children were supposed to change in memory, not blur. She had been seen rarely, always near the house, always close enough to retreat if spoken to, her eyes fixed on the ground as though trained to study it. Then one Sunday she simply did not appear. At first, the neighbors assumed illness. Winter had been unkind that year, and fevers traveled faster than news. When her absence stretched into weeks, questions surfaced carefully, wrapped in politeness. Mrs. Sullivan told the same story to anyone who asked, her tone gentle and rehearsed, explaining that the child had been sent to live with distant relatives for her own good. No location was given. No names were offered. The explanation floated, just beyond the reach of verification, light enough to discourage pursuit. What unsettled people was not the story itself, but the lack of transition. There had been no farewell, no wagon packed with clothes, no neighbor asked to watch the house while preparations were made. In a community where departures were communal events, even quiet ones, this vanishing felt unnatural. The girl's name stopped appearing in casual conversation, as though it had been erased rather than forgotten, and those who tried to picture her face found their thoughts sliding away, unable to settle on detail. The house reacted differently than expected. No mourning marked the loss, no signs of adjustment or sorrow. The Sullivans' routines remained unchanged, precise as ever, yet those closest noticed a shift at night. The rhythmic sound beneath the ground grew denser, heavier, as though an additional weight had been added to its pattern, Some claimed they heard a faint crying woven, briefly, into the rhythm during the first nights, after the disappearance. Though no two accounts agreed on its tone, only on the feeling it left behind. A seamstress who had once mended the girl's dress realized weeks later that the garment had never been retrieved. It lingered in her shop, unfinished, its small stitches waiting for a body that would never return. When she carried it to the Sullivan house, hoping for explanation or payment, Mrs. Sullivan accepted it without comment and folded it carefully, as though adding it back into an invisible collection. The seamstress left shaken, aware that she had just handed something living, adjacent to a place that consumed such things without acknowledgement. Children sensed the change before adults admitted it. They began counting themselves unconsciously when gathered, tapping fingers against palms to ensure no one had slipped away unnoticed. One boy swore he heard his name, whispered from beneath the Sullivan property one evening, spoken in the vanished girl's voice, stretched thin and altered, as though learned rather than remembered. His parents dismissed it as fear, yet barred him from walking near the house after sunset. When the local schoolmaster asked after the missing child, noting her absence from records, Mr. Sullivan replied smoothly that the girl had never attended regularly, suggesting the teacher was confusing her with another. The certainty in his denial unsettled the man more than anger would have. Records were checked. Names shifted. Ink marks seemed lighter than before, as though the paper itself resisted holding them. What should have been a clear discrepancy softened into ambiguity, then into doubt. At night, some neighbors reported seeing movement behind the Sullivan basement windows for the first time. A flicker of shadow passing too low to be an adult's. The light never lingered. It pulsed once, then vanished. The rhythm beneath the ground adjusted again, accommodating something new. Those listening closely noticed an added pause, a hesitation that felt like a correction being made. The idea that the child had been sent away began to feel less like a fact and more like a suggestion implanted for convenience. People repeated it to each other without conviction, testing how it sounded aloud. Each repetition made it feel thinner. Yet no one challenged it directly, because doing so required admitting a far worse alternative. Silence became a form of cooperation, a way to avoid imagining what happened to children who were removed not from homes, but from notice. Months later, when another child was glimpsed briefly at the window, taller, thinner, with eyes too old for their face, some wondered if it was the same girl returned, altered by time and distance. But the proportions were wrong. The posture was different, and when she moved, it was with the careful precision of someone who had learned how not to make sound. Those who saw her felt a cold certainty settle in their stomachs that whatever left the Sullivan household had not gone far at all, and whatever remained below the house had learned how to take in what the world above was willing to surrender. The deliveries began as a quiet irregularity, the sort that slipped easily between habit and oversight. Once a week, sometimes twice, wagons arrived at the Sullivan property carrying barrels of water, sacks of flour, crates of bread, and salted meat in quantities that raised eyebrows only briefly before being rationalized away. Large families required large provisions, people told themselves, and though no one could recall seeing many Sullivan children at once, the idea of them existing somewhere within the house had already taken root. What mattered was that payment was always made on time, in clean coin, without complaint or bargaining. The miller was the first to notice the pattern clearly. He had supplied flour to the Sullivans for years, long enough to know how much a household typically required to survive a season. The numbers written beside their name in his ledger had nearly doubled within a single year. Yet the house itself showed no outward sign of expansion. No new rooms were added. No additional smoke rose from the chimney. The garden remained modest, its yield unchanged. When he asked Mr. Sullivan whether a celebration or gathering explained the increase, the man smiled and said simply that appetites varied, then ordered another sack. Water deliveries were harder to dismiss. Barrels arrived even after heavy rain, even when the well on the property should have been sufficient. The man who hauled them noticed that the barrels were always taken inside immediately, never left standing, and returned empty far too quickly. Once, out of curiosity, he tapped one before unloading and was startled to feel warmth through the wood, as if the water inside had absorbed heat rather than cooled during transport. When he mentioned it, Mrs. Sullivan thanked him politely and closed the door without comment. Bread became the most troubling. Loaves arrived fresh and disappeared within hours. No stale crusts were thrown out. No scraps were fed to animals. The baker's boy, sent to collect payment, lingered once to see if he could spot the family at supper through the window. He saw only shadows passing low along the walls, too many to count, moving with a strange uniformity. He left quickly, later unable to explain why his hands shook so badly. He dropped the coins twice on the road home. Neighbors began adding up what they could see against what they knew. The visible Sullivans could not possibly consume such quantities. Even accounting for unseen children, the numbers felt wrong, excessive in a way that suggested not indulgence, but necessity. It was as though the food served a purpose beyond nourishment, as though it was being distributed, rationed, measured carefully against something that demanded consistency rather than comfort. The rhythm beneath the house seemed to respond to the deliveries. On days when wagons arrived, the sound at night grew more pronounced, fuller, as if strengthened. When a shipment was delayed by weather, the rhythm tightened, quickened slightly, carrying an edge of urgency that set nerves on fire. One night, when a delivery failed to arrive at all, the sound escalated into something frantic, metal scraping hard against stone until dawn broke and the earth finally stilled, exhausted. Those closest to the property began to notice a smell carried on the evening air after deliveries were made. Yes, damp grain, and something faintly sour, like breath trapped too long underground. Windows were shut more often. Candles burned lower. People told themselves it was coincidence, that imagination thrived in communities starved of novelty. Yet the smell followed no wind, clung to the ground, and faded only toward morning. A church elder, troubled by the strain on communal resources, questioned Mr. Sullivan about the fairness of such heavy purchasing when others struggled. Mr. Sullivan listened patiently, then explained that he took responsibility for many dependents who could not be seen, a phrase spoken so calmly it chilled the room. The elder left with the unsettling sense that he had just been corrected, rather than reassured, as though he had misunderstood the nature of what responsibility meant within those walls. Children began to whisper theories among themselves, piecing together fragments overheard from adults. They imagined feasts held underground, endless rows of mouths opening in the dark. When scolded, they insisted they were only repeating what the ground itself told them when they lay awake at night, ears pressed to pillows, feeling vibrations carry upward through their bones. No one ever saw waste carried out of the Sullivan house. Ashes were minimal, scraps non-existent. Everything brought in vanished completely, absorbed without remainder. The house did not give back what it took. It only requested more, and the Sullivans obliged with unwavering dedication, as though fulfilling a contract older than the land itself. By the time the community acknowledged that the deliveries were not excessive, but essential, the realization arrived too late to feel like a warning. The wagons continued their route. The barrels continued to empty, and beneath the house, whatever relied on that steady flow of sustenance adjusted and endured, growing accustomed to being fed, growing patient in the knowledge that above ground, people were still willing to mistake compliance for normalcy. The storm arrived without warning, rolling out of the mountains with a violence that split the sky and flattened fields in a single night. Rain fell in sheets so dense it erased distance, turning roads into rivers and yards into churning pools of mud. The Sullivan property sat low against the woods, and as the hours passed, water began to collect where it never had before, pooling near the back of the house as if drawn there by design. Neighbors watched from their windows, uneasy at how the water seemed to favor that ground, circling it, pressing closer with every surge. By dawn, the rain had not eased. Fences collapsed. Livestock broke loose, and the earth softened into something that could no longer hold its shape. A narrow trench opened behind the Sullivan house, carved by runoff that cut deep and fast. When the water finally slowed enough for the land to reveal what it had taken, something dark surfaced through the mud, catching the light in a way stone never did. It was curved, rusted, and unmistakably worked by human hands. A farmhand from the neighboring property was the first to approach, drawn by the strange glint half, buried near the trench. He knelt, brushing away mud with cautious fingers, expecting perhaps an old tool or discarded scrap. What emerged instead was a length of iron chain, thick and heavy, its links fused with age and corrosion. It was anchored deep into the ground, disappearing beneath the foundation of the Sullivan house. When he pulled gently, it did not budge. The chain felt less like debris and more like a root. Word spread quickly despite the weather. People gathered at a careful distance, their boots sinking into wet soil as they stared at what the storm had uncovered. No one spoke at first. The sight carried a weight that discouraged speculation. Chains were not uncommon in rural life, but this one felt wrong in context, too substantial, too deliberately hidden. It had not been discarded. It had been placed. As the water continued to drain, more iron revealed itself. Additional links surfaced, arranged in parallel lines that suggested order rather than accident. Some disappeared back into the earth at sharp angles. Others ran straight toward the house, vanishing beneath the stone foundation. The realization crept in slowly that this was not a single chain, but part of a system, something engineered to restrain or connect or organize whatever lay beyond sight. Someone suggested calling the Sullivans out to explain. When Mr. Sullivan finally appeared at the back door, his expression was unreadable, his calm intact despite the gathering crowd. He glanced at the exposed chains briefly, then at the people assembled, as though assessing not the discovery but the reaction. He claimed ignorance, suggesting old mining equipment or remnants from before the house was built. His voice did not rise. It did not waver. Yet when asked why such equipment would be anchored beneath his home, he offered no answer at all. The rain began again, lighter now, but persistent, and with it came a smell rising from the disturbed ground. Damp iron, stagnant water, and something organic, something long confined. Those closest stepped back instinctively, covering their mouths. The trench gurgled as water drained into it, revealing a circular opening where none had existed before. It looked like a collapsed drain, narrow and deliberately concealed, its edges smoothed by use rather than erosion. A man with a lantern leaned closer, lowering the light toward the opening. The beam disappeared downward, swallowed by darkness that seemed deeper than it should have been. As he watched, the light trembled, not from his hand, but from a vibration traveling upward through the ground. The familiar rhythm returned, faint but unmistakable, now close enough to feel beneath their feet. The lantern swung harder. The man pulled back, pale and shaking, unable to say what he thought he saw moving just beyond the reach of the flame. Children were ushered away. Women crossed themselves. Men argued in low voices about responsibility and danger, about whether to fetch authorities or leave well enough alone. The Sullivans remained by their door, neither retreating nor advancing, their presence acting as a barrier more effective than any fence. Mrs. Sullivan's gaze never left the opening in the ground, her expression not fearful but attentive, as though monitoring a wound. As the day wore on, the trench widened. Mud sloughed off the sides, revealing more iron embedded at regular intervals, some shaped into rings, others bolted directly into stone. The pattern suggested capacity, planning for far more than a single restraint. It hinted at repetition, at the accommodation of many bodies rather than one. Those looking began to understand that the basement was not merely a room, but an extension of something older, something that required infrastructure. When someone suggested cutting the chain to see how far it went, the reaction was immediate and sharp. Mr. Sullivan stepped forward for the first time, his voice firm now, warning that disturbing the structure could cause the house to collapse. The claim sounded reasonable enough to stall action, yet it did nothing to ease the dread settling over the group. If the house depended on what lay beneath, then its stability came at a cost that had been hidden deliberately. As evening approached, the storm clouds thinned, and with them came an uneasy clarity. The ground had not revealed the chains by chance. The flood had stripped away what was meant to remain unseen, exposing a truth that had been anchored deeply and patiently, waiting for the right pressure to surface it. The opening continued to seep water, drawing it downward, carrying with it leaves, twigs, and the faint echo of sound that rose back up altered, muffled, and collective. By nightfall, the crowd dispersed reluctantly, driven away by exhaustion and the promise of returning with help. The Sullivans closed their doors. Lantern light flickered briefly behind the basement windows, then vanished. Beneath the house, the rhythm adjusted once more, settling into a slower, heavier pattern that matched the weight of what had nearly been discovered, as if whatever lay below understood that concealment had failed but containment had not, and that the chains, now tasted by air and rain, were still holding, still binding, still doing the work they had always been meant to do. The farmhand was not meant to be there alone, yet circumstance placed him at the Sullivan property in the gray space between decisions. When urgency outpaced caution, the storm's damage had scattered work across neighboring lands, and he had been sent to check the integrity of a shared boundary fence that ran close to the Sullivan house. The exposed chains and the shallow trench still lingered in everyone's thoughts, but no formal action had been taken, no authority summoned, only promises exchanged and delayed. The house loomed quiet, its windows dark despite the early hour, and for a moment the farmhand considered turning back, telling himself that nothing more could be learned without witnesses. It was the sound that stopped him. Not the familiar rhythm from beneath the ground, but something closer, sharper, a muted thud followed by a faint drag, as if wood were being pulled across stone. It came from inside the house, low and restrained, then ceased abruptly when he shifted his footing. He stood very still, listening, feeling the damp earth cool through his boots. The silence that followed felt intentional, like a held breath. The back of the house bore marks from the storm that had not been there before. Mud streaked the foundation, and one section of wall near the cellar had cracked just enough to reveal a seam. It was narrow, easily missed, but to someone already primed for wrongness, it looked like an invitation. He told himself he was only checking for structural damage, that he would knock first, announce himself. Yet his hand found the loose edge of the cellar door before his mind settled on a plan. The door opened with surprising ease, its hinges sighing softly rather than protesting. Cool air spilled out, heavy with damp and iron. He hesitated at the threshold, lantern held low, the flame fluttering as if unsure whether to continue. Below him, stone steps descended into darkness that seemed thicker than the absence of light should allow. He called out once, a simple greeting, his voice sounding wrong in the confined space, flattened and swallowed before it could echo. He took a step down, then another, driven less by courage than by the feeling that retreat now would not undo what had already noticed him. The walls were close, slick with moisture, and etched with shallow grooves that ran parallel to the steps. He could not tell whether they were scratches or marks left by something being dragged repeatedly along the same path. The lantern light trembled, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of his hands. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a wider space than expected, extending beyond the footprint of the house above. Stone pillars supported a low ceiling, and between them ran lines of iron anchored into the floor, some disappearing into the walls, others stretching out of sight. The air vibrated faintly, not with sound, but with tension, as though the room were charged and waiting. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of his own breathing, loud and clumsy by comparison. It was then he heard it, unmistakable and devastating in its clarity. A collective inhale, dozens of lungs drawing air at once, followed by silence so complete it pressed against his ears. He froze, lantern held aloft, its light revealing movement at the far edge of the space. Shapes shifted there, low to the ground at first, then rising cautiously, like figures unsure whether they were permitted to stand. The voices came next, not cries or screams, but whispers layered atop one another, overlapping into a single hush that carried words too fragmented to understand. The moment his light touched them fully, the sound stopped. What remained was the sight of eyes reflecting back at him. Too many, arranged at different heights, some peering from behind stone supports, others fixed directly on him with an intensity that made his knees weaken. They were children. That much was undeniable, despite how wrong everything else felt. Thin bodies wrapped in mismatched cloth, wrists bound loosely with iron links that allowed movement but not escape. Their faces bore expressions that did not match their ages, blank not from fear, but from discipline learned too well. They stood close together, connected by chains that ran between them, forming lines and circles that suggested order imposed over time. As the farmhand's shock deepened, a subtle change rippled through the group. Heads tilted in unison, eyes narrowing slightly, attention shifting past him toward the stairs. The lantern shook violently now as the familiar rhythm began again, louder than he had ever heard it. No longer confined beneath the ground, but resonating through the room itself. The chains trembled, metal chiming softly against metal, and with it came a low murmur that felt less like speech and more like agreement. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, unable to look away as the children stepped forward together, stopping just short of where the light fell strongest. None reached for him. None tried to flee. They simply waited, their stillness more frightening than pursuit. In that waiting was the sense of instruction, of rules deeply ingrained, of consequences understood without explanation. A sound from above broke the moment, a footstep on the cellar stairs, slow and deliberate. The children reacted instantly, lowering themselves, retreating into practiced positions, their chains guiding them back into order. The whispers ceased. The room emptied itself of movement with terrifying efficiency, leaving only the iron and stone and the echo of breath that did not belong to one body alone. The farmhand turned and ran, scrambling up the steps, the lantern nearly torn from his grasp as he burst back into the open air. He did not look back as the cellar door closed behind him, sealing itself with a finality that felt rehearsed. He fled across the yard, lungs burning, mind unraveling, carrying with him the certainty that what he had heard fall silent was not the end of sound, only its concealment, and that beneath the Sullivan house, dozens of voices had learned exactly when not to speak. The farmhand reached the road before his legs gave out, collapsing into the mud as daylight broke fully across the fields. When he tried to speak, only fragments came, words stripped of sequence and sense. It took hours before anyone understood enough to act, and even then, understanding came reluctantly, as if the truth resisted being assembled. By the time authorities were gathered and courage hardened into resolve, the Sullivan house had closed in on itself again, quiet, composed, waiting. They arrived just before dusk, a small group armed more with obligation than certainty. The exposed chains behind the house were gone, buried once more beneath freshly packed earth that bore no sign of haste. The trench had been filled, the drain sealed so carefully it looked as though it had never existed. The house stood intact, its walls clean, its windows dark. When they knocked, there was no answer. When they forced the door, the silence inside felt staged, deliberate, like a room prepared for inspection. The basement door resisted at first, then yielded with a sound like a sigh released after long restraint. The steps descended into cold darkness, but when lanterns were raised, the space below was smaller than described, narrower, emptier. Stone walls closed in tightly. The iron lines were gone. No chains lay on the floor. No cloth, no bodies. No marks of recent presence beyond dampness and the faint smell of iron that clung stubbornly to the air. The cellar appeared unfinished, unremarkable, incapable of holding what the farmhand had described. Above ground, the house offered nothing either. No records. No signs of excess food or water. The Sullivans themselves were nowhere to be found, their belongings reduced to essentials, as though departure had been planned long before discovery threatened. Neighbors searched the surrounding woods for days, then weeks, turning up no tracks, no shallow graves, no answers. Eventually, the searches slowed, then stopped, leaving behind only the uncomfortable certainty that nothing had truly been resolved. The official report was brief and unsatisfying. It spoke of misunderstandings, of hysteria fueled by storms and rumor. The census entry was labeled in error. The farmhand's testimony was recorded, then quietly set aside. Life, as it always did, pressed forward, demanding attention to crops, repairs, and the living. The Sullivan house stood empty for a time, avoided instinctively, until necessity forced its sale. The new owners renovated, sealed the basement completely, and spoke often of how peaceful the land felt once cleared. Yet some things did not leave. Children continued to count themselves without knowing why. On certain nights, when rain fell heavily and the ground softened, people felt vibrations beneath their beds, faint and familiar. Travelers passing near the old Sullivan property reported hearing a hush fall over the woods, followed by the sense of being observed by something patient and numerous. No one ever stayed long enough to investigate. Years later, a ledger was discovered in a county archive, misfiled and overlooked. It contained a census entry that did not match any known household, listing names without surnames, ages without progression, all marked as residing below. The ink had bled slightly through the page, as though written with too much pressure. When the record was brought to attention, it was deemed an anomaly and returned to storage, where it remains, preserved and unread. As time passed, the story of the Sullivan family softened into folklore. then into something closer to discomfort than fear. People learned not to ask where the children went, only to agree that they were gone. The land was divided, built upon, normalized. Houses rose where the old one had stood, foundations poured deep into soil that had already learned how to hold secrets. And sometimes, when the ground is saturated and the night grows very still, those living above it wake with the sensation of being counted in return, of breaths aligning briefly with others not their own, of a rhythm beneath them adjusting, accommodating, enduring, patient in the knowledge that discovery does not require revelation, only time, and that chains do not need to be visible to remain unbroken.